2023 Tennocon concluded and we got new Soulframe footage. 30 minutes of it, in fact. More like EnvoyCon, am I right? I'm wrong, it's still probably over a year before this game is out. But since we have new footage, I want to take a closer look and see what we can tell about the abilities used and the overall ability system. First ability we see is a Petrifying Finger Snap. This appears to apply a hard stun crowd control effect. They're petrified, cannot take any action. It should be noted that every time this happens, the player does follow up and manually kill the enemy, so we can probably assume this is not a permanent effect. The first enemy petrified is a big guy with the two-hander, and later in the demo we see the player fight a similar guy, normally without petrification, and we can see that he has a lot of health, so clearly petrification also applies some sort of armor debuff or damage multiplier whenever you attack petrified enemies. We can see a co-op partner use this ability, in which it's revealed that it is AoE, and if we take a little closer look at the player use it, we can see it's a two-step ability where they first go into sort of an aimed stance with the reticle, and then they execute the ability with the AoE likely centered around the reticle. The player never uses this ability against bosses, so we can't really tell if it will have any effect against harder, tougher enemies like that at all. From what we've seen, this ability appears to function as AoE trash crowd control. The second ability is a Personal Shield. The co-op player also appears to get the shield buff. Shortly after using the ability, the player is hit by a ranged attack. It does no damage, but it looks like there might have been a little bit of stagger. One thing I haven't been able to figure out is why the co-op player loses the shield. You can see around the time they lose the shield drone emits this sort of lightning effect. That happens a few other times, and it seems to correlate with sword strikes that kill enemies, so maybe you can also consume part of the shield to buff attacks. It isn't very clear, and the ability expires after 20 seconds. I think on the surface this looks like a pretty typical temporary defensive buff ability, but I think there are some hidden mechanics that we just don't have enough information about to say anything for certain right now. The third and final true ability we see is a Ground Shockwave. It appears to knock back and knock down enemies, along with a little damage, although the damage does seem minimal. It does appear to work on bosses, although it really only briefly staggers them, but that might be enough to use as an interrupt when a boss is doing a dangerous attack you want to stop them from doing. I think this is meant to be used as a single target CC ability against stronger enemies. Now I have to mention the fourth ability, because they do say this.
Oh yeah, I should say that because we're an envoy of souls, every location in the game has kind of these wandering souls, and they constitute, I guess you could say, like a fourth spell slot. So we'll see how that works in a moment.
Now if we take a closer look at those icons, we can see the first one is a fire effect with a pentagram and a single tick. The next one is, I don't really know what, with a running dude and a single tick. And the final one is what looks like maybe some sort of toxin element and a pentagram and 2 ticks. Probably safe to assume that the number of ticks indicates how powerful that ability will be. And we see the player does find the fire guy, and they get a flaming sword buff. This looks like an elemental infusion on the melee weapon, so it's probably safe to assume that the other pentagram option was a different elemental buff that was a little stronger. We can also see in the bottom right that there's this little fire icon now. Partway filled, so I assume that means there's going to be a timer or some energy use mechanic there that currently isn't implemented, as it does not change at all. And when leaving the area, it looks like we lose the buff. So my prediction for this is whenever we enter a procedurally generated dungeon like this, there will be 3 options you can get placed randomly in the dungeon with various different effects and power level. My big concern is if this game ends up being a live service MMO like Warframe, where you're going to run the same thing over and over and over again. I think most people are going to learn to ignore this mechanic and just come up with the build that's self-sufficient and consistent. Or worse, the game is very hard and the buffs become key parts of meta builds, and people restart dungeons over and over until they get the buffs that they want. Next, I want to take a closer look at the equipment screen and the UI elements themselves to see what we can tell about the ability system overall. There are three main sections I want to highlight. First is the Virtues equipment section. Second is the UI element that shows in the bottom right during gameplay, and the packed section of the equipment screen. There's also this souls section, but it just appears to provide some stat buffs right now, and there isn't really anything else we can tell about it. First, let's take a look at the virtues section. We've got courage, spirit, and grace. Something I want to note right off the bat is that each of these are associated with a color and symbol. Courage is a red sun, spirit is a green moon, and grace is blue star, maybe? Something else to note about this is the color of the leaf for each stat is inversely proportionate to the number. It kind of looks like the numbers might go from 1 to 20, and the higher the number, the less color you have in the leaf. This is pure speculation, but I think there might be a trade-off mechanic going on here, where the higher the stat you have, the less energy or maybe less life, since life is in the center there and it's sort of got roots in the colors, but the more powerful the things affected by that stat are. Maybe having 8 courage is why the shockwave ability did not do very much damage, but we can't say for certain. One other thing to note is that there are 2 times where the player receives a skill point notification. Both of those times it does show the courage sun, so this kind of implies that there are skill trees associated with each of the virtues, and that maybe you can only have one equipped at a time. That sounds a lot like the Warframe focus system, but based on everything else we see, it seems like all 3 virtues are always in play, so I don't think there's anything we can say for certain about this, but it should be noted. Next, let's take a look at the UI element in the bottom right that appears during gameplay. First thing to note, 3 circles, 1 for each ability. Each one shares a symbol and color with a virtue, so I think we can safely say that each of the abilities corresponds to one virtue. There's also life and sort of a ring around the center ability. I don't know if that has any significance, I assume not. So first, I want to note that each time you use an ability, a little bit of the color is removed. I assume this is the start of an energy system, but that amount seems to be the same for every ability. It doesn't look like there are any cooldowns or anything, so I assume this is a work in progress system, and I don't think there's that much information we can predict about the energy system yet, outside of each virtue getting a separate energy pool. Button prompts do appear before the player executes an action, so we can probably assume that casting an ability is a 2-step process, at least on controllers, where you hold down something and then you can press one of the buttons seen to execute an ability. There is this weird icon in the top right. To me it looks kind of like the shoulder and upper arm bit of the robo arm, and you can see there's like a little dot there, like there's little spots for ammo, and we can see at the very beginning of the demo they start with 1, and in the dungeon they take out this weird thing and get another. Now right after the shield ability expires, we see something really interesting. The player enters sort of this power stance and fires a shoulder cannon. We can see that this action consumes one of the little dots on that UI icon. So this looks like a very powerful ability that consumes a very limited resource. Now, let's take a look at packs. First, the developers did have this to say.
So in Soulframe, rather than changing your Warframe, you're going to just change, every game needs a magic arm, I assume, so that's what we have here. And you will be changing your pack.
So with packs representing a Warframe equivalent in Soulframe, it's probably safe to assume that packs come with abilities and some sort of passive effects. Likely the shoulder cannon thing is associated with the pack used in the demo, but we can't really say for sure. Now there are 2 really big things I want to note. First, when they scroll through the packs, the ability icons are reused, and they're sometimes in different slots. Now this could just be that the art's in progress and those are temporary placeholder art, but given helmsmithing is a mechanic in Warframe, I think it's also possible that they fully let you customize the abilities you use with each pact. I also want to point out that each of the ability slots is associated with the symbol for one of the virtues. And since some abilities appear in 2 different slots for different packs, at a minimum that implies that you can choose which energy resource and scaling stat they use, but perhaps each ability also has 3 different variants, 1 for each virtue. but there isn't anything to really confirm that yet. Now let's take a look at the packs themselves. So they start on Fae with the 3 abilities used throughout the entire demo: Shockwave, Petrify, and Shield. Then there's Ode Tempest, which has this weird unknown Pokemon looking thing, a wolf and a bird. And then we've got Orengal with a wolf, Shockwave, and the unknown looking thing again. Now, I don't think there's really much we can tell about the unknown looking thing wolf or bird abilities. Like the shield ability is very clear that it's kind of some defensive shield thing, but those, I have no idea. Now, something interesting to note here is that they say they're going to use Ode Tempest in this demo, despite starting and playing the first part of the demo in Fae.
Probably going to do the Ode Tempest for this one. Yes, thank you.
And they do switch to Ode Tempest, and the Robo Arm does change, and that change persists. However, the abilities for Ode Tempest do not actually get set to the abilities that the player has in their UI and that they actually use. So something weird's going on. I assume they had the demo on rails and they forced the player to only have those abilities to be 100% sure they don't show something broken or really in progress. However, I think Mr. Crumb Guzzler should have been a little bit more careful with this character name. I think the big prospect here is that they may be moving away from an MMO class-like system that Warframe sort of has, where each Warframe is sort of designed to do a specific thing, and its abilities and passives work together to make that happen. And instead, we may get a system where you can mix and match abilities as much as you like, but there aren't built-in synergies between abilities. Now let's take a look at some of the other ability-like things that the player does. First, I have to mention the sword throw. The player uses it throughout the demo, and it seems pretty good. They briefly show but do not talk about a dedicated range weapon slot in the UI, and that really seems redundant with the dedicated sword throw. So I think that each melee weapon might come with a unique ability similar to how each weapon in Duvari in Warframe has a unique ability, and the sword throw is this weapon's unique ability. Next, I want to mention the wolf mount summon. I don't think this is really an ability. I can't imagine anyone would use it repeatedly to take down enemies. I think it may either be scripted or just a flavor thing that happens when you summon the mount, but it is cool nonetheless. We also see the player use a sense ability. This seems like a typical video game sense ability that highlights points of interest, maybe gives you a little path to the next spot you're supposed to go. Nothing out of the ordinary. And finally, we do see the player use a heal. I think there are 2 ways this could go. First, we have a dedicated heal button like we have in Duvari and Warframe. Or 2, they briefly show an elixirs section, and it's possible that this will be a customizable elixir. They have a whole bunch of elixirs. I assume there are elixirs for doing all of the normal stuff you expect, boost your damage, regen energy, etc. They really only showed the icon, so there isn't much we can tell about the system right now. Overall, I think it's clear that the game is still pretty early on, and these systems are not very fleshed out and are subject to change. I do think they're going for more of a customizable, come up with your own build design, rather than the more class-based design they went with for Warframe. Now, as for the abilities in particular, I felt that they were quite powerful against trash. Petrify in particular seemed super OP. But the abilities seemed quite useless against bosses. And while I think, however, they're planning on managing how often you get to use abilities is in progress, it didn't look like you would actually get to use them that much based on the energy values that they showed. Now, I should note that it looks like abilities fully fill at the start of boss fights, which is a nice quality of life thing if they decide to keep that. So maybe they're going for limited ability uses in each section, but it refills at the start of each section. So you're not just spamming abilities all the time, but you also don't fall prey to too good to use syndrome where you're saving abilities only for times when the situation is truly dire. With that, it seems like the normal melee weapon combat is going to be the bread and butter of most combat encounters, and that makes me a little worried right now because the normal melee combat doesn't actually look that great right now. Whether it's fair or not, this game is going to be compared to the Souls series, and the Souls series has set the bar for this type of combat, and Soulframe just does not meet that bar from what we've seen in the demo. The hitboxes on the boss were a massive example of this. They were straight up awful. I really hope they at least fix that before this releases. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here since I meant to make this video about the abilities. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Do you like the direction they seem to be taking Soulframe? I'm still fairly optimistic. I think they could make this a really great game, but I think the window is still open for Soulframe to get filed under bad Souls-like clone in many people's minds. But we'll have to see. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. See ya.